Hey, good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock right now because we've been having some technical difficulties this morning working through so that I can actually share with you images of the quilts that two people were very kind and generous to share with me since the last quilt documentation day we had on Facebook Live a month ago. So let's see here. I guess we can start right away. You know, I didn't realize until this week that this is Mother's Day weekend, and I thought, oh my gosh, one of the quilts that Sharon Webb shared with me, and Sharon is AKA Gamecock Mom 2020. So congratulations, Sharon. But yeah, so she shared with me a quilt, and I'll hopefully be able to show this to you. There we go. And I think Sharon's going to be with us at some point this morning. But this is a quilt, a baby quilt, that her sister, Cindy Flynn Walker, made for her when her first child was born. And it was made in Illinois, but it was made with fabrics that her sister Cindy had taken from muumuus and Hawaiian shirts from the time that she had been an Army RN in Honolulu at the Tripler Army Medical Center. And it was there that Cindy introduced Sharon to her to-be husband. So this quilt is a really interesting, I would call it a Mother's Day quilt. I know a lot of us think that Mother's Day comes once a year, but I had a friend once who said to me, Mother's Day should be our children's birthdays because those are the days we become mothers. And we remember those days so much more than our children do, right? Our children have no recollection of that experience, and we do. So I think of this as a Mother's Day quilt. Now it's a baby quilt. It was made as a baby quilt, and it's a one patch quilt. So Cindy just took, again, Hawaiian shirts and muumuus that she had or accumulated when they were in Hawaii, when she was in Hawaii, and pieced together a fairly simple baby quilt using red, the red border, and red is on the back as well, and a blue border, which, given that she was in the military, it's kind of neat that this has a kind of red, white, and blue sensibility to it. And the other thing I love about this quilt, apart from the fact that the Hawaiian fabrics are just so much fun, is that it's actually made in mostly primary colors. And I don't know how many of you know this. She may have because she's a nurse, but babies actually can't see pastels. And so if you're making a quilt for a baby or getting a quilt for a baby, getting it in, a pale pink or blue or yellow just won't do much to help the baby develop, being able to see. So baby quilts, this is a great baby quilt because it's very stimulating. It has a lot of high contrast, primary colors, and I just want to thank Sharon, for sharing that with us. Oh, Sharon, you're here. Hey. Yeah, I mean, this is a wonderful baby quilt that I'm calling a Mother's Day quilt as well, because your sister Cindy made it for you on the birth of your first child. And in many ways, it's a celebration of you becoming a mother, but also of the time, I guess, in Hawaii when she introduced you to your to-be husband. So this quilt is just very, very rich with family history, and it's a great family memento. Sharon, would you like to share any thoughts about it yourself? I'll wait and see if she writes here in the sidebar to share with us any more information about this. But I just love that she that she shared this with us, and go Gamecock Mom. Thank you. And I think she might be sharing some other things with us that a friend of hers has as well. So next month we might be looking at some other interesting kinds of things. And I think her sister actually made another quilt that she may be sending images of as well. So again, thank you, Sharon. So the next series of quilts that I'll be able to share with you is thanks very much to Drusilla Brookshire. So Drusilla came in person to our first quilt documentation day, and she came towards the end of the day, and she had so many quilts that her grandmother had made that she wanted to have documented, that we made an appointment to meet with her at a separate time to do that. And then, of course, COVID happened and we closed the museum. And so I reached out to Sharon earlier this week and asked her if she would be willing to share any images of her her quilt. Oh, Sharon. Okay, so Sharon is saying in here, she says, I was wrong in thinking the stitching on the border quilt was waves. It's actually intended to be rainbows. So, and she said, Cindy stitched a quilt pocket hanger on the back, but it was never hung. Too precious. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, it's hard to see, the quilting, but it is in kind of like a rainbow or wave fashion, and it's a very traditional way of quilting a pattern. It's often called a clamshell pattern as well. So yeah, it's beautifully quilted. It's wonderfully handmade with lots of love from Cindy to Sharon. So we'll move on to the next. The next image here again is of the first quilt, or one of the first quilts that I decided to share with you from Drusilla Brookshire, because her grandmother made 3 of these, and her grandmother's name was Athelai. I mean, this for me is a big challenge, the spelling of it and the pronunciation. Athelai Lyons Brown, born 1897, and she passed away in 1975. So this is the first quilt that has a date on it, with an early date of 1939. And it is a trip around the world, a variation of what many folks call a postage stamp quilt, because the size of the squares, some people literally did them the size of a postage stamp, very, 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 very tiny, 1 inch. This is a little bit larger scale, but it's the same idea of being able to use scraps. And it's again, just like the one we just saw, the baby quilt. This is a 1-patch quilt. So it's one size patch that's used to create obviously a very different effect visually, because she alternated lights and darks, and you can see in this bigger picture, how that, it has kind of a kaleidoscopic kind of sensibility, with the darker ones in the middle, and then dark around the outside, light, dark, light, dark. I mean, Athelai was very, very skilled at putting together these particular scraps of fabric that she had in 1939. And this quilt is actually embroidered, not only 1939, the date, but to Martha. And Martha was Martha Joe, and she was Athelai's youngest daughter. And the owner, Drusilla Brookshire, acquired many of these quilts from her Aunt Martha, because when Aunt Martha passed, she was the executor of her estate. So she acquired many of these through her aunt. And I have to tell you, when I first started talking with Drusilla, what excited me so much about what she was letting us do is that this is a body of work by one quilt artist. And it's rare that we have an opportunity to really document that. Back when eBay was fairly new, and it was when I first moved to California to be the director of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. But I would watch eBay. On eBay, I would see that a dealer had clearly gone to an estate sale and purchased 12, 15 either fully made quilts or quilt tops unfinished, and they were selling them off right on eBay. And you could tell they were all from the same family, or a lot, or same woman. And my heart just was always in my throat about that, because I thought, oh my gosh, here we have, a whole body of work by a quilt artist, and it's getting sold off piecemeal, and we'll never have a chance to document them all as a body of work again. So for a while, I made my friends, my folklorist friends in particular, kind of crazy, because if they lived near where I saw, these quilts being auctioned off, I would call them and I'd say, okay, can you contact the dealer and ask them if you could please document these quilts before they're dispersed? And of course, they thought I was crazy, and they all had their own projects, and that was not a good strategy for trying to stop what I saw happening. So what happened was, again, we kind of missed an opportunity in some cases, or in many cases, I would suggest, to actually document whole bodies of work by either one quilt maker or a family of quilt makers, because many estates would have multiple pieces made by multiple members of a family, often in them. So I just have to thank Drusilla again for having the foresight to want to document her grandmother's quilts before they are, she is carefully dispersing them and placing them in one case in a historical society in Georgia, where well, we'll talk about that later, but she's really being intentful about the future homes of these quilts, and is to be congratulated for that. And so again, this was the trip around the world for Martha, and we thank Martha because as the youngest, I guess, she probably was around more when her mom had time to make quilts, because her mother was 42 when she made this quilt. So it's the earliest, again, dated quilt by Athelai. And it was made when Martha was 10 years old. So at that point, the quilt maker would have raised her other kids, her older children, and they would have been of an age where they didn't need as much support from their mother. And it looks like, yeah, she and Martha it seems like that had a special relationship, I would say, even because clearly Martha valued and what her mother did and her mother's needlework skills, and she became the steward of those. And then Drusilla took on that role when Martha passed. Let's see here. So here you see, yeah, to Martha in 1939. And you can see the fabrics are kind of a mix. Clearly they were fabrics that had to have been produced before 1939, but they contain, the dark navy would have been a late 19th century kind of fabric. But you see feed sack fabrics as well, especially the pink and the blue, and the lavender was very, very popular in the 20s and 30s as well. So this is another trip around the world. Again, I thought it was interesting that Drusilla has 3 quilts that were made in the same pattern by her grandmother. And this next one was made in 1942. She embroidered the date, and she said, this time, from mother. And this one was made for her second son, Melvin Virgil, and he was known as Bill. So I think that's interesting, that she would make the same kind of quilt, again, very scrappy, which is an indication that she probably sewed a lot for her kids and around the house. I mean, she clearly had access to a lot of scraps. This one, the yellow pops out at me as, in the framing. Again, the darker fabrics in the center, then lighter, the yellow frame, blue. So again, she clearly had a very keen color sensibility in putting together these trip around the world quilts. And there it is. Okay. Oh, this is the third one. Do I have a big picture of the third one? No. Yes. Okay, there it is. So the third one it was made, let's see here, 1947. So you have 1939, 1942, 1947. She made the same pattern over again for different members of her family. So this was made to Felton. Okay, so Martha was her youngest daughter. The second one she made for her second son, and Felton was the second child of her oldest son, Ralph. So this was for a grandchild. And she wrote on it, to Felton from grandmother. So again, I'm always fascinated by how and when quilters decide to write on their quilts and self-document. And while she never put her own name in there, she clearly did identify herself on the second two of these Trip Around the World quilts um, as the mother and then the grandmother. So she clearly, valued herself in that role, and she trusted, and her trust was well placed. She trusted that people would know who mother and grandmother was as this got passed on and passed along. And what's really fun about this particular quilt is that I hope you can see on your screen the novelty fabrics. So in the 40s, novelty fabrics became very, very popular. So you have people, you have, cowboys on horses, you have, I thought I saw a clown with some balloons. You just have a lot of really, really fun pictorial fabrics that often were made for children or used in quilts made for children. Very bright primary colors, really fun. So again, I think, the timing of when those novelty fabrics became available and her wanting to make this for her oldest son's second child, her grandchild, coincided really nicely. Okay, I'm coming back here to the sidebar. Are all of these quilts hand sewed? Okay, so what's really fascinating to me is that, at least according to Drusilla remembers her grandmother sewing on a treadle machine, and she would piece using the machine, but then everything was hand quilted. I mean, this was a really, really, I would say, hardworking, practical woman, right? So she would in the afternoons watch soap operas and piece on the machine her quilts. And then she would hand quilt them. And sometimes Drusilla remembers her mother inviting 2 or 3 other women in, again, the neighborhood. She lived out in the country. And I think I failed to even tell you that. So she lived in Calhoun, Georgia. And she was married to a man who was what Drusilla calls a dirt farmer. So they raised all of their own food, animals, and what Drusilla remembers most about her grandmother is that she was always busy. Her grandmother made a cobbler, a fruit cobbler, every single day that Drusilla can remember. So she was canning. She was in the garden. She was again, sewing. Her grandmother sounds like she was a very tireless person. She married at 16. Again, had 4 of her own children. And when she married a man who was older than she was and had 2 children by a previous marriage. So she, at 16, had, she married into a situation where she had 2 kids then, and then she had 4 more children. And she spent, you can imagine, a lot of time on a farm. Then it was rural. Now the town of Calhoun has grown up to be closer to it. But and her grandmother never learned how to drive. And so, but that didn't stop her from having lots to do, and certainly from wanting to make her home beautiful, and wanting her children and grandchildren to have something that she made that was also beautiful. So yeah, I think. Wait a minute. Let's see here. I'm amazed by what she did. So this particular quilt, I decided to show this one next because last month, if any of you were here with us last month, one of the people who participated last month, Irene, she was struggling with a conundrum. She said, I had this Indian wedding ring quilt, and that's what this particular pattern is. And she said, the books, or she says, I understand that pattern came into being in like 1930s. And yet in my family history, she said, I have documentation that, it was from the 1880s. And how do I make sense of that discrepancy, she said. And so, so afterwards, after the show, I went I went and looked, and sure enough, in Barbara Brackman's Encyclopedia of Pieced Patterns, she dates it to the 30s, right, as the first published version of this particular pattern. Excuse me. And then I went on to the Quilt Index, because the Quilt Index is just this amazing resource that Michigan State University maintains. And I searched for Indian wedding ring quilt, but then I also searched for pickle dish, because this particular pattern is also called the pickle dish pattern. And sure enough, in the 1880s, there were several pickle dish patterns that came up. So I wanted to tell Irene, don't worry, there is not a discrepancy. Yes, your family history is accurate, potentially, very much accurate. I mean, this pattern clearly was in circulation long before it was ever published in a source in the 1930s. So this particular version of it, and again, let me see if I have a detail. You can see many people are familiar with the wedding ring quilt, and what distinguishes the Indian wedding ring quilt from the wedding ring quilt is the use of triangles instead of bars to create the circular pattern. So, and it means it's much more difficult. Working with triangles with fabric on the bias is much harder than working with just straight pieces of fabric. And I love the fact that, she very cleverly placed the black or darker print fabrics very strategically. They aren't all grouped in one place. They are kind of spread out and throughout with the lighter color fabrics. And whereas in many of these kinds of quilts, you will have a multi-blocked center, where on this one there are just plain muslin colored blocks. There's just this really interesting play of light and dark and use of negative space, I would say. Very powerful use of negative space. And this one, I think I don't have I think a larger version of it did not make it up here. Nope. So, and I'm really sorry, because this is the more traditional wedding ring quilt. So instead of, to create the circular pattern, instead of using little triangles, the quilt maker decided to use, the more rectangular pieces. So this would have been easier for her to piece. And I'm sorry that I don't have a larger image of it, because what's really striking about this particular version that Drusilla's grandmother made is the use of that cranberry fabric, that kind of purplish cranberry fabric, as the ground fabric. It's stunning. And she must have just had a bunch of it that she needed to use up, or came into it, or she went out and got it and just decided to experiment with a very unusual version of this particular pattern. Because when you see the whole quilt, you see the yellow and the green squares, those end up being in the center and sort of punctuating the dark cranberry color. It's just really visually striking. And I'm seeing here that there is writing on this particular quilt. And yes, this was from 1946. So it says, to Felton from grandmother. So again, a really wonderful statement of her using quilts for the family. And again, making really interesting and unusual color choices in this particular instance. So I love this because this is a butterfly quilt pattern. Very common in the 1930s and 40s. Butterflies were very, very popular as applique. And let me see if there's a detailed image of this, because yeah. She used a buttonhole stitch rather than an invisible stitch to create the outline of the around the outline of the applique of the individual butterflies, and created, because again, if you go back and look, the dark centers of those butterflies create this kind of visual rhythm across the whole quilt. But then again, she used scraps, very scrappy quilt, to create a more labor-intensive piece than her other pieces would have been. So she had an applique phase, I would say. And being a quilt maker myself, I'd say I've had my applique phase, where you just want to challenge yourself to do something different from what you've been doing in terms of using the machine. Although this is block style, right? So she did the individual blocks and then sashed them with the pink sashing. But it was a great way to use up scraps, and to challenge yourself with a little bit more of a difficult pattern that would have been hand done, hand stitched. And she, like I said, used a buttonhole stitch with the black thread so that it created a kind of outline for these particular butterflies, which I think is just really an interesting choice, because a lot of quilters would have chosen to do an invisible applique stitch. And in this case, she chose to use the stitch to create a visual impact with the darker thread. Really pretty. So this is a pansy quilt. I looked this up because I had a great Aunt Ida, who, when I started going to family reunions in Alabama, she took me to her house one day when she learned that I was interested in quilt making. And she had an old farmhouse out in the middle of very rural Alabama. And she shared with me this pansy pattern. So when I saw it, I was like, my heart, oh, great Aunt Ida. This particular, there are many different, applique floral patterns. This one was first published in Needlecraft Service, or by Needlecraft Service, which was a pattern, a kind of kit company. You could order patterns from them. So I don't know if Drusilla's grandmother, ordered this, or, some of her neighbors might have ordered it and they shared the pattern around. But again, she chose to do an applique pattern, which is a little bit harder or more labor intensive than a something you piece up on the machine. Again, she used a kind of a green fabric that's sometimes called like a Nile green fabric from the 30s, 40s, very popular with quilt makers. Yeah, I think of this, like I said, of her applique face, and you'll see she continued to use the black buttonhole stitch to do the applique, so that in addition to using the applique stitch to sew the fabrics onto the white ground, she created this sort of outline, a kind of so that the pansies kind of pop from the black being around the borders. And I hope you can see if there's a detail, but the quilting on these are really fascinating, because she outline quilted the pansies, but then she created a kind of a sunburst around them in each of the blocks, which is really beautiful. A nice touch for the quilting. You can see, can't see the sunburst as nicely, but yeah. So you can see the sunburst here. So again, Drusilla's grandmother. Oh, Frances. Okay. Drusilla is correcting me about the quilt. I'll have to go back and look at my notes, Drusilla, because it was to her mother. Maybe it was the cranberry wedding ring quilt. It was for Drusilla's mother, Frances. So yes, next time we have Lisa Lanfer is saying she'd love to see the whole quilt with the cranberry ground, the wedding ring quilt. I will make sure that I include that next time, because it's really stunning. And you so rarely see a wedding ring quilt that has that kind of dark ground as a fabric choice, and it's really, really beautiful. So I'll be sure to have that. But you can see here in this picture of this is the Balloon Girl. So this was a pattern that was first published, again, Needlecraft Service, which was begun in 1933. So the pattern would not have been available a printed pattern until after 1933. So again, this is a very, very special piece, because this is the one that Drusilla donated to a museum in Georgia, because each of these particular girls that has balloons, is holding balloons. Let's see if there's a close up here. Yes, has a name on it. So it's like an album quilt, and we don't know if the individual people made their blocks and contributed them to the whole quilt, or whether Drusilla's grandmother actually made all of them and embroidered the names of the people that are on them. But Drusilla thinks that based on her recollection of who she grew up in this community, Drusilla did. So she recognized many of the names, and I guess when she shared this quilt with some of the people she just knew and said, "Oh, guess what? Your mother's on here, or your aunt is in this quilt." They all were like, "I want this quilt. Well, can I buy that quilt?" And Drusilla thought, "Well, no. This everybody needs to be able to enjoy this quilt," which is why she very smartly donated it to a museum where everybody in the community can see a quilt that her grandmother really created as a record, a visual record of a particular community of women. And many of them, Drusilla recalls, were members of the Amazona Stewart Circle, which Amazona Stewart apparently was a young woman who had passed away in their church. And they created a social circle of women. And so apparently this particular quilt documents that social circle, but it also includes Drusilla's grandmother's mother-in-law, and let's see here, and Drusilla's great aunt. So they were not members of that social club at the church, but Athaliah wanted to include them, or did include them. So we're hoping to be able to get a list of all the names, and maybe next time we can share more specifically the scope of the community of women that this particular quilt documents, because it's just remarkable to me that, well, it's not, because now we have book clubs, right? I mean, women have always found ways to come together and support each other, and it looks like Drusilla's grandmother was documenting that experience of that group of women who were her support system. So it'll be really exciting to see and kind of really more depth understand who these women were in their relationship to Athaliah's life. So yeah, there's Nellie with the N spelled backwards, and I'm trying to find. Yeah, that was Drusilla. Well, let's see, Drusilla's. I have here that it was her paternal grandmother. So again, this quilt is a great documentation of the circle of women that Athaliah surrounded herself with. Okay, I love this one because earlier I talked about how it seems that Athaliah had a very special relationship with her youngest daughter, Martha Jo, and I just absolutely adore this quilt because Athaliah is documenting her own work and her own legacy. And she made this for Martha, and she used dresses and what were called baby aprons to make it. So she took the scraps from her youngest daughter's clothing and aprons, and she created this 9-patch, which again is the sort of basic quilt that uses up scraps, and that young girls were taught how to sew using a 9-patch to begin with. But let me show you a close-up. So this, you can see, I hope it says 5 baby aprons. So on this, she documents 3 baby aprons, 2 baby dresses, 5 baby apron, 8 baby apron, and 12 baby dresses. So again, Athaliah was self-documenting with this quilt, and I just think that it's amazing that she took the time to embroider that on these quilts, this quilt that she made for Martha Jo with her childhood clothing scraps. Okay, so this is the quilt that Drusilla has on her bed and she uses. It is a monkey wrench quilt. That's the pattern. And what's so interesting to me about this quilt is Athelai's choice of using solid fabrics against either stripes or plaids. So the reason it has such visual impact is because of the use of the solids against the plaid. So they really pop there. They make for a great graphic. It's really a really stunning quilt. The pattern, see, I looked up when the monkey wrench quilt pattern first was published. And it looks like it was called the double monkey wrench pattern by Ruth Finley in 1929 in a book she wrote called Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them. It was also published in 1928, a year earlier, as a hens and chickens pattern in Wallace's Farmer, which was a farm magazine published in Des Moines, Iowa. So we don't know how, Athelai got this particular pattern. It was very popular because it's a variation of essentially of a 9-patch and easy to make, sew it up on the sewing machine, but has lots of visual, again, potential because of the use of contrast solids versus print or stripe or in this case plaids. So really nice quilt. Again, you can kind of see here. Oh, I know what Drusilla was showing us. So it looks like the binding on this quilt probably wore out, and Athelai or someone else added a second binding to be able to keep using the quilt. So it was clearly valued. It was used perhaps, and then rebound. Okay. Let's see. Is there a close-up of that one? No. Okay. Okay. This, if you look at the quilt behind me, it's called a snowball quilt pattern. And it's a very simple, 4-patch pattern, but it can be made in many, many ways. And when I first saw this quilt, I didn't recognize it as a variation of snowball. It's actually because, Athelai chose, instead of using solid fabrics to create a more bold graphic design, she pieced many of these pieces that normally would not be pieced, that would have been whole cloth. And so it took me a while and looking at the detail to see the pattern. So here is, the curved pattern, the curved piece that would make this circle, which in the quilt behind me, the circle fabrics were all white so that the snowball popped out. So this particular pattern, let's see, it's dated, looks like 1946, I think. Yeah. Embroidered MJB, Martha Jane Brown, 1946. Or Martha Jo Brown. Okay, so this was also made for the youngest daughter, Martha Jo, in 1946. And Martha said that it had been made from scraps from her dresses. So again, special relationship between Athelai and her youngest daughter, Martha. Again, you can see some of the circles here. Again, but hard to see. What you see mostly are the stripy kind of the piecing of the pieces more than you see the circles. So incredibly visually complex piece here. So this is the last one I'm going to be sharing with you today. And the reason I chose to share it is because, we often think that quilters sort of either only do, quilts to keep you warm out of scraps. And this one clearly belies that. Yes, many of Aethelai's quilts were made from scraps that she clearly had accumulated over years and years of sewing. But this particular piece, which is, originally I thought it was Carpenter's Wheel, but no, it is called the Winding Ways. It is actually a 4-patch, and it's done in 2 colors. So Aethelai had to be very intentful about this quilt in terms of picking the pattern and then deciding to go out and purchase enough of 2 colors, the blue and there's a peach, to create this really visually stunning quilt. So quilters are complicated people, and especially when they create quilts over 40 years of their lives, they will try different things. They will certainly do things that are fast and easy on the sewing machine, but then they'll challenge themselves with applique. And this particular piece would have been incredibly challenging because of the curved pieces and the triangular pieces. So I hope we have a detail. Yeah, if you can see this. And it was embroidered with E, and we don't know what the E means or alludes to. But yeah, let's see here. Okay. Sharon is saying, seeing the quilt from the baby's clothes, have we come full circle with the trend to make t-shirt quilts to commemorate graduations? Yeah. I mean, I really think so. And I know a lot of the students at the University of South Carolina, they ask their moms or their grandmothers to take t-shirts, cut them up, and make them into mementos of their experience of their high school and college years. So yes, I think that repurposing fabrics, from a particular period of your life in order to kind of capture that experience and take it with you and hold it dear is something that we are still doing. So yeah, Sharon, thank you for making that observation. So back to Aethelai and this quilt that I'm sharing with you as sort of the last one here in our series. Again, she really, really challenged herself with this particular quilt in terms of the complexity of the design, or using the curved pieces, and it being a 2-color quilt meant that it was a special quilt. Quilters make all kinds of quilts. They make quilts to be used up, but they also make special quilts, and the same person can be making quilts in different styles over a period of 40 years. That suggests how their skills evolved, because when we looked at, and again, Sharon, I'm sorry, not Sharon, but Drusilla, I had her look at the borders of as many as she could look at in terms of how these particular quilts were finished. And most of them were finished by taking the backing fabric and wrapping them over to the front of the quilt. But a couple had separate bindings, which says to me, again, she had access to more resources at that point, because, doing a binding that's separate from, taking the back to the front takes more fabric, just plain and simple. And it takes more time. I mean, it's more labor intensive to do a separate binding than it is to take the backing and wrap it to the front. But the thing about wrapping the back to the front is that when it wears out, as we saw in that one particular quilt where the binding clearly did wear out, you had to add another piece, and you lose a little bit of the edge around the whole quilt when you have used the backing fabric to bring to the front with the binding. So on the quilts where she actually took the time and energy to do a separate binding, those quilts will stay, you won't lose anything if those bindings have to be replaced. So the overall visual effect of the quilt will remain the same, because you don't lose any of the edging trying to add a new binding onto it. Let's see here. Got a question from Anita. It's great to see you. Jane, will there be an online gallery of the next hanging of the quilts in piece by piece exhibit? Yes, there will be. We have gotten word as of this past week that the university will be reopening for students and the public as of the middle of August. So we are now getting ready to I mean, many of the quilts have already been prepped for hanging the third version of the quilt exhibit at the museum. But some still have to be done. So we will be working very hard to get those quilts prepped. And yes, there will be a third iteration of the quilt exhibit at the McKissick Museum. Thank you for asking that. But I should tell you that because of COVID and because we realized that that in terms of, I mean, there may be many members of our community who don't feel comfortable coming out in public until, we are further along in the phasing of the federal guidelines to reopen. So, so we're looking at those very closely in terms of the gating criteria that, that preclude the phasing in of opening public venues. And so there will be, again, some people in high risk areas or high risk categories who won't be able to come or won't feel comfortable coming. So we are working really hard to, like with this program, move it online. So we will be doing an online exhibit of the third iteration of the quilts. And probably because, we are getting smarter at doing these online kinds of things, we probably will have all of the quilts from all three versions as part of the online exhibit for this exhibit. Physically, we're limited to about 16 quilts in the large gallery we have, but online we're not limited. So we can have all the quilts that have been featured over the last year, and then the new ones that we're going to be in the third version of this exhibit added to that as an online exhibit experience, so that people who are interested in quilts and love quilts, but don't feel safe coming out in public at this particular juncture, we'll be able to see them. And that show will be up through the end of the year. So yeah, we bumped it because our curator of Folklife and Fieldwork, Sadler Taylor, was called up on military leave because of COVID. So, and he had been working on an exhibit that was a new exhibit that was supposed to open in that gallery for the fall. But because of his being called up, we've obviously needed to postpone the opening of a new show. And because no one got to see the third version of the quilts, we thought, well, we'll just open that in the fall and keep that up through December. So so it will be available. Drusilla's correcting me. She's saying that this particular quilt is more turquoise and coral peach. I can clearly see, the peach. And I guess, colors when you do photography are always a little tricky, but yeah. Oh, Anita, you're so kind. She says, thanks for the work. Well, again, if you haven't learned or figured out already, quilts are really my thing and textile. So, so I'm thrilled that, again, that Sharon and Drusilla were kind enough to share images of the quilts that they have with us, and excited to be able to document, again, a body of work by one particular quilter who worked, many years trying different things and has left a legacy that I think it's important to honor. And here on Mother's Day weekend, it seemed very, very fitting. Does anyone have any questions? Again, there are many things about these individual quilts I did not discuss in detail because it just isn't possible in the time we have here. And also because I have not seen them in person. So there are probably things that, I can speak to. And clearly, like we're looking at now, you can see the back of the Winding Ways quilt and see how it's quilted, which is very unusual because it doesn't follow the outline of the pattern at all. So again, the choices that, Athalai made in terms of, fabric choices, quilting design choices, really, really fascinating to look at in depth. Sharon says, your thing, what's your background? Oh, I'm always fascinated by how McKissick staff got to where they are. Well, again, my background is very, I was a theater person living in New York City for many years. And I went back to graduate school because I was really interested in the history of women in performance. And I wanted to kind of build for myself. I was a theater director and performer, but as a director, I really felt like I wanted to know more about, the history of women in performance to inform my directing practice. And so I got into graduate school and at NYU in the performance studies department. And after I was there for several months, the then director of the program, the chair of the department, was Dr. Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett. And she was a folklorist. And she took me aside and she said, Jane, if you're really interested in the history of women in performance, you're going to have to look outside the history of Western theater at those forms of culture, cultural production, where women had some power and control. Because the history of Western theater, unless there's a nun in Germany, Roswitha, who wrote a play. But at that time, when I was in graduate school, which was the 90s, you could count on one hand the number of plays written by women. And so she was teaching a class on the aesthetics of everyday life. And at that time, we had to we had to do a project, right? The big project for the course, you had to document what she called and what anthropologists call a cultural performance. So that means a parade or a festival event. And at that time, the Museum of American Folk Art in New York City had partnered with 3M Corporation to create the Great American Quilt Festival in New York City. And so I documented the Great American Quilt Festival as my paper project for that course, and was absolutely knocked out by what I saw. I had grown up with quilts and kind of, always liked fabrics and all, but it occurred to me when I went to that festival and they had a show and tell session at this big quilt event, right? Where you could get up and say anything and talk about anything. And I also interviewed individual quilt makers, and they all had what I came to call origin stories, like how I made my first quilt story, and it made me realize that quilts and textiles, were often props for performative behaviors, storytelling. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that even presentation gifts of quilts were opportunities that women kind of seized in order to have a public voice, to make their opinions known in time frames and places where maybe they didn't have formal access to the vote or to formal education, reading and writing. That quilts and textiles served as a way of creating that public space. So I back-ended into museum work because I was interested in the history of women in performance. So that's a long story, but yeah, it says here, FYI, the photos that show the entire quilt were taken by Glenn Adams with a drone hovering about 8 feet above, which really shows the stitching. Yeah, Drusilla, you have to love people like Drusilla because they she went above and beyond to try to capture images, really accurate images of the quilts that her grandmother made, and had a drone, had a friend with a drone fly over to take those full pictures, to try to capture the overall visual effect of the quilt and design, but also in many cases you could see the quilting pattern really nicely that way. So I hope I answered your question about how I came to quilts, and what's really interesting, and maybe we'll talk about this in another episode, but there's evidence, and in fact, when I was doing some research on South Carolina quilts, that women actually sang for each other at quilting parties, right? So they would have their friends over, and before the days of radio and TV or video, there's a whole body of songs that women, I think, would perform, that have they're traditional songs, where women are giving advice to women. And there are some where women are giving advice to men too, which makes me think that when the men came, at the end of a quilting party, often, the guys would show up and they'd have a big meal and they'd be dancing and play party games. So there are even songs, written from the point of view of a woman addressed to men, kind of giving them advice about a particular thing in their community, like, don't hunt, at sunset because, it's hard to see and you might kill your girlfriend. So there's a whole body of songs that I've done some research on, and used to perform in a band that I was in when I lived in New York City. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that whole dimension too. And it just, again, provides, I think, really a window onto how women have lived and supported each other and had um, created a way, out of no way to have a voice and make their opinions known. So, yeah, I thought about, descending into performing a song or two, but not this time. But they are really fun, and some of them are hilarious, actually. So maybe next time I will. I'll start with the newspaper article where I found, I think it was in the 1920s in South Carolina, a young woman was having a quilting party, because again, quilting parties were coming out parties, and often, when a girl was going to get married, they'd have a quilting party. And in this particular South Carolina newspaper article, they talk about how I think it was ragtime music, that there would be ragtime music performed, and then the mother would be performing mountain songs. So clearly, it was a transitional time where the young woman wanted, ragtime to dance to, and the mother still wanted to perform some mountain songs as part of this event that she may have, learned as a young girl and learned at quilting parties. So to be continued. Thank you again. Again, I'll wait for a few seconds to see if anybody else has any questions relative to what we've said today, or questions for Drusilla or Sharon, because again, they were the really brave folks who made this happen by sharing the quilts that they have. And again, thanks to both of them. Does anybody have any questions for Sharon or Drusilla? Well, I don't see any coming through. Nice, thank yous. Well, again, you're very welcome. This is what gets me up in the morning. This is my passion. So, will this video be available later? Yes, it will be. We are recording it, and so it will be available on our Facebook page, and I think on YouTube possibly as well eventually. So to all the mothers, our mothers, our grandmothers, happy Mother's Day weekend, and I'll look forward to talking with you all, next month. And if you know anybody who has quilts they want to have documented, again, please have them send pictures to me, email me, call me. I'm really, really excited when that happens, because it's just so much fun to learn about these women and this history. So thank you, and stay safe.